we're talking about months and months and months, over a year long process, um, to get to this point. I believe when all the news dropped, they put the timeline of a 14-month long investigation. And for me, sort of reading that number on it, it's just the investigation, right? I
Yeah.
think we can go back further. I think that's the layer of sadness of it for me, where it's like, actually, um, the investigation may have taken, 14 months, but we're talking going back even 16, 18 months, where there was, these preliminary national reports, right? Out of the Washington Post, with, Guy McCullough coming forward and
Yep.
already speaking about things like verbal abuse or emotional abuse, or undergoing, racial abuse, by a head coach in Washington Spirit. And um, as we've gone through what feels like so many of these now, there's also the commonality that this has been generational, right? In terms of all of these very sad and horrible things that players have had to go through, that while so much of the emphasis, especially within this final report, has been a big focus on NWSL, I think what a lot of people have seen, if they weren't privy to that before, is how much of this crosses over different eras
Yeah.
of women's professional soccer, right? Um, so I think yesterday's result, I think for some people might feel, final. I think there was a lot of discussion in the lead up to the release of this result. Is there were many clubs, even the Players Association. A lot of it was getting pointed back to this investigation. A lot of phrasing where it's like, we're going to wait until the results of the
Yeah. Yeah.
the joint team investigation. We have to wait until the joint team investigation is concluded. We have to withhold further. There was a lot of pointing to this one thing, this one moment. And now it's fully
Now
released.
we're
Now
here.
it's out there. Now we're here. Now we're here to talk about it, right? So it's just interesting to sort of maybe take that first step in talking about this, because I mean, Lisa, you and I were in DC to cover the championship final, and even there, we're talking October, so we were a few weeks out from the U.S. Soccer Commission independent investigation by Sally Q. Yates into, allegations of abuse within women's pro soccer. And then there's an NWSL championship just at
Mhm.
the end of that month. So you have a topper and a capper for October. And NWSL Commissioner Jessica Berman um, had made the rounds, right? In terms of availability and making herself available to speak to various outlets, to media, to supporters. And within her State of the League address, talked about this joint investigative report. And she said at the time uh, that the outline was a sort of a three-pronged approach. That first, it was seeking the truth, second was going to be corrective action, and third, systemic reform. So that, I think, what we saw in the news drop yesterday was that third step. They want to have all of that, moving forward. So um, I think that was one of the things that people were also looking for in in this release. That you've got all of this full report. It's accessible. It's out there if folks want to read it. We will just continue the same um, phrasing that everyone else has been using, because we believe in it, that you should take it in your own discretion. It's not an easy read. None of these reports have been easy reads. There's a lot of um,
That's that was
sickening
like
things
one of
within
my
it.
biggest things. The NWSLPA put it in their statement. It is a hard but
Yeah.
necessary read. I echo that.
Yeah, and we do too. So I mean, there are links to it. We have something up on CBS Sports, if people need if they need a version that isn't so jarring, that's up there. But there's also links to that as well. In terms of what this is, right? We're talking maybe a little bit about the timeline of things. Um, this joint investigation investigative report really came out of this collaborative effort, um, between two parties, the league and the players association. And as we're taking a little bit of a look at things chronologically, um, one of the things that we've been covering over the past year or so is how this joint team investigation came to light. And I know you remember, Lisa. I mean, it was October 2021, and we saw players participate in like on-field demonstrations. They were holding a minute of silence. They issued the league some demands, and within those demands, it included the investigation that they wanted to have a very thorough joint investigation. And within that, the league immediately obliged. So at that time, I believe the league had already hired Covington and Burling to conduct an independent investigation, but the Players Association wanted an investigation of their own as well.
Yeah. So that's when the Players Association, they got Wheel, Gottschall, and Mangis for their own PA investigation. But at this point, the NWSLPA was also demanding things for the league to change, right? They were issuing their list of demands that they wanted from the league in order to move forward and have player protection when it was protect the players last year in October. So at that point was when the two investigations decided to combine and move forward with that, because they could get a lot done. And I think now that we have these results, as you mentioned, Sandra, so much of it was these clubs saying, hey, we're going to wait to the results. We're going to wait for this. We're going to wait for this. I mean, even you think back to James Clarkson, former head coach of Houston Dash, in April of 2022, James Clarkson was suspended. And we haven't heard anything until right now when this results dropped about what happened. And this report, it focuses on former North Carolina Courage and Portland Thorns head coach Paul Riley, Rory Dames, former Chicago Red Stars head coach, and Christy Holly, the former Racing Louisville head coach. They're the big focus, and they were also the big focus in the U.S. soccer independent investigation that was led by Sally Q. Yates that was released in October. And that investigation was separate from this joint one by the league and the PA. But one of the most shocking things about this report to me is that it didn't just focus on those three coaches, Riley, Dames, and Holly, that were named in the Yates report, but it includes 7 other former head coaches, assistant coaches, former general managers. It involved so many different clubs, a majority of the clubs, past and present. And the fact that this investigation covers so much that it was from the past too. It's not just stuff that has already been reported. There are so many things that are newly reported in this that have not had the public attention as some of the coverage of what Paul Riley, Rory Dames, and Christy Holly have done.
Yeah, I think that was one of my headspaces yesterday too. It's like shocking, not necessarily, but still horrific and incredibly upsetting. Like there at this point in time, just going through the timeline of things, I don't think it should surprise anybody that there's somebody like Paul Riley or Portland Thorns or Chicago Red Stars or Arnhem Whistler or Rory Dames or Christy Holly, Racing Louisville, those sort of targeted kind of, that's the correct word, not target. Those sort of names, those sort of clubs that have been kind of these focal points in terms of these investigations. That part I think isn't surprising for folks. I think at this point, I think it's still incredibly difficult to have to reread and go through various traumas, within those organizations and um, by those parties. But the fact that within this joint investigative report, uh, we get more details and information about how it's essentially in every club, problematic issues everywhere. And I don't think it shouldn't be surprising that when we're talking about a franchise like the Thorns, when we're talking about Paul Riley's time with that club, that all that in North Carolina, terrible behaviors and terrible things occurred with Paul Riley in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like predictable. And it's so sad that
Mm-hmm.
this person went from one franchise and one club in one area into another, and you have more players speaking about traumatic things that they endured under that former head coach's tenure.
Yeah.
It's like it's one of those very direct lines, those two very clear dots that you can connect as problematic. And it's just this continuity. It's another example to where you could see where it's like if you don't take care of your players in phase 1,
Yeah.
something else happens and there's a phase 2. So it's in that sense, it's just like, I think for me, for folks who for whatever reason have been trying to process these types of things, and they've perhaps fallen short on connecting those lines, this is one of those things that they can look at and say, hey, there was a bad thing that happened here and it was not taken care of, and players' safety was not a priority. And look what happened in other areas. And it's just yeah, like I said, it's just unfortunately for me, I can't speak for everyone. For me, is it surprising and shocking? No, but it is still so, so sad.
Yeah. I think like that's important to talk about because as you mentioned, Paul Riley continued coaching in the league after numerous reports, and that was all detailed in the Yates report, and it is again detailed in this joint investigation by the league and the PA. But the fact that he continued to coach at North Carolina and continued to do the same things that he was reported for doing at 3 previous clubs, under many different ownership and general managers, all with whom were until very recently still employed by their clubs and owners in this league. And the fact that this player now felt comfortable enough to come forward in this investigation and say, hey, we're hoping to make changes. That is incredibly brave. That is incredibly strong of these players to put their name on a report like this and say, this happened to me, because the what happened and with Paul Riley at North Carolina, everything from sexual misconduct and inappropriate relationships with players and blurring of these professional boundaries, inappropriate statements about players' weight and body types and other emotional misconduct leading to eating disorders of players. And it's so frustrating to think that this could have been stopped years ago, if the reports that these players submitted to persons in charge and leadership were done correctly, right? And those correct steps were taken. And there's so much in this report, in terms of the clubs that are involved: North Carolina Courage, Portland Thorns, Houston Dash, Kansas City Current, New Jersey, New York, Gotham FC, formerly known as Sky Blue FC, OL Reign, Orlando Pride, Utah Royals FC, and the Washington Spirit, as well as the conduct that is listed in this report. Sexual abuse, manipulation, those have been widely reported, right, in the Yates report that came out, but also mocking players' bodies, pressuring players to lose unhealthy amounts of weights, crossing professional boundaries, creating volatile and manipulative working conditions, using derogatory and insulting language, displaying insensitivity towards players' mental health, engaging in retaliation against players who attempted to report or did report. And that's something that's so key to this too, that there was retaliation and there still was the scare of retaliation. But the misconduct, this was a quote from from the report, the misconduct against players has occurred at the vast majority of NWSL clubs at various times from the earliest years of the league until the present, until this very year, 2022, in the 10th season of the 10th year of the league. And that to me is insane. It is insane. And I know you said that it's not as shocking. Maybe I'm still naive in this, the fact that we cannot believe players. We cannot trust their word. We cannot say, hey, when they say, hey, I want to be traded from this club, not ask why. That was also detailed in this under Paul Riley at North Carolina. Player saying, hey, I want to be traded. I don't want to be here. And ownership and people in charge not asking, why do you want to leave? Why don't you want to be coached by Paul Riley? Instead, just saying, you can't go anywhere. That's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. A 10-year-old league and undergoing various reports. And I mean, we were talking about Clarkson, right? Or Orlando Pride and Cromwell and Green. And these were things that occurred in this season.
Mm-hmm.
You know? It's, I don't know if it's, you know, like you said, if it's naive. I think it's just jarring sometimes.
Yeah.
It's just almost just jarring to the point where you just sort of feel like, why like, why didn't you listen to these players? Why weren't they and their concerns taken seriously? Why
That's the
right?
jarring part. That's the shocking and the jarring part. Honestly, not that it happened, because this is a systemic issue, and it's happened in youth soccer and all the way up to the professionals. And we already know how horrible some of the people that are involved are, and how horrible that the conditions were, and all of this. The thing that is most shocking and most frustrating is that nothing was done until now. Well, frankly, nothing still is done at this point, right? These are just the results of the investigation. Yes, there was an investigation done, but that is due large in part to the players and the PA coming forward and saying, we demand change. We demand working conditions where we are not scared to come to work. We are not scared to talk to our employers about our working conditions due to retaliation, of getting traded, of getting benched. We are not forced into eating disorders and sexual misconduct. And that is why this investigation happened, because the players were brave enough to stand up and say this and put their careers on the line and do this. And for that, I mean, thank you to those players, right, who came forward and were so incredibly brave and continue to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's it's appalling, the list really that you can go down of things that like players have sort of gone through and endured over this span of time. You know, whether we're talking about sexual coercion, misconduct, abuse, verbal, mental, emotional abuse. My God, homophobia within that,
Racial,
racism, 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 racism. It's like we have to keep talking about that, because that has absolutely fallen behind, I think, in terms of and how this has been discussed and how this has been reported and how this has been talked about. You have a very good, capable, strong, you know, players in this league who have tried very hard to ensure that that component, that level of abuse shouldn't go undetected, shouldn't go unchecked, shouldn't go unnoted. And yet it still constantly sort of falls by the wayside. There's this weird sort of concept that the players in this league are affected collectively by things like, you know, pay equity issues, or things like, you know, harassment or sexual harassment, or, you know, inappropriate, you know, comments in the workplace, and how like there's this weird sort of blanketed thing where it's like, oh, this affects all of us. But you know what doesn't affect everybody and only affects some players? Racism. And it was very difficult to sort of navigate and look at all these things being laid out in terms of player experience. And that was heartbreaking for me that there are some things here that players have gone through that some of their teammates can never understand
Yeah.
or can never actually grasp. Um, there are players in this league who are not going to know what it means to navigate this world as a black athlete, just full stop. And there are experiences that they have that they will not hopefully ever have to go through again. And I think like with this report, I think for me when we're looking at those next steps, um that was something that I was immediately trying to look for, coming out of these releases for, statements from the league. um I think for a lot of people finally getting to to see this report or try to sit with it and know that they can go through it and see a ton of different clubs and the fact that they've had to go through various investigations. I think I also saw that on the timeline as well. There are folks out there who are like, "Oh no, not my club," and got to give those folks, I think, equal amount of space to try to process that as well. But yes, your club.
Yeah.
Yes, every club, honestly.
Every club.
Yeah. Um, I think that was something you could just sort of see, like in those sort of kind of reactions, you could sort of see, well, like, wow, like there's going to be some things here where people really maybe need to take that time and sit with it, and process it. And that was really something that we heard coming out of yesterday's release a lot too. That there was a lot of like, please read the report, take your time with it, and try to process it as much as you can. And I think I think that as well, Lisa. I think you and I were also sort of struggling with that as well because we've discussed, um, the timing in which this report was dropped. We're recording this. We're going live with everyone on Thursday morning, December 15th, and the report was released Wednesday afternoon.
Hmm.
Um, and it was right in the middle of a World Cup semifinal.
Yeah.
And I think I can't speak for all media. I don't think we could speak for all media. We can only kind of speak for ourselves. But I don't think it was so much about. Um, I don't think it was so much about the fact that it was dropped in the middle of a big game, and oh no, we're being this is a distraction from a really big game, and we just want to have fun and watch soccer. Like that's not it at all. Um, it's I think it's a bit of a disservice. I think it's all the things that we've been talking about all year, and how we're going to learn and how we're going to grow and sort of get past all of this, still sort of found this repetitive problematic thing where it's like you're dropping a very important thing, in the middle of something where it's not getting a lot of eyes or getting a lot of attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
to,
It's
to
like when
generate.
the Chicago Red Stars announced that Rory Dames was fired as their head coach, what, 11:59 midnight?
Yeah, you choose the timing isn't great, and it also, I think, in a league that has been really struggling and trying to get back trust with its core supporters, and core audiences, um, and the issue of transparency. I think the league that's been struggling with that, I don't think that this did them any favors.
Yeah.
Um, and all of the sentiment about player first and player driven, movements and moments, um, it's like we've learned nothing because you've got, um, a soccer media landscape that uh, wants to cover these things, and that's a disservice to the players. It's a disservice to the players when the choice is made to release this in the middle of a of the world's on the world's one of the world's biggest events. Um, you saw a lot of like split attention, and when you have that, that doesn't give the appropriate time or eyes or care or access to such a big moment, like that, because that was a big moment.
Yeah.
The results of this report getting released is a very, very big moment. And I think it's one of those moments that this league wants to point to and look at and say, hey, this right here, this is actually the starting point. This is the jump off point. And we can actually go through and try to ensure that we're implementing, appropriate protocols and procedures to ensure that the players always remain safe.